most states because of the new consumer protections the sweeping legislation requires. Consumer protections is just the White House's way of saying more red tape.
Debate from the Senate floor yesterday. Live now to the Senate as lawmakers will continue deliberations on the Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development Appropriations Bill. A vote on final passage could come today. And now live to the U.S. Senate here on C-SPAN 2.
The Senate will come to order. The chaplain, Dr. Barry Black, will lead the Senate in prayer.
Let us pray. Our Father, be with our senators not only in great moments, but also in the repetitive and common task of life. Make them children of faith and heirs of peace. May they tackle even mundane responsibilities with integrity and faithfulness, cheerfulness and kindness, optimism and civility. Lord, give them wisdom to be patient with others, ever lenient to their faults, and ever prompt to praise their virtues. May they bear one another's burdens and so fulfill your law. Keep them ever mindful of the brevity of life and of the importance of being faithful in little things. We pray in your merciful name. Amen.
Please join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. The clerk will read a communication to the Senate.
Washington, D.C., July 25, 2013. To the Senate, under the provisions of Rule 1, Paragraph 3 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, I hereby appoint the Honorable Brian Schatz, a senator from the state of Hawaii, to perform the duties of the chair. Signed, Patrick J. Leahy, President pro tempore.
Mr. President,
Majority Leader.
following my remarks and those of Senator McConnell, there will be a period of morning business until 11 a.m., with the first 30 minutes controlled by the majority and the second 30 by the Republicans. Following that morning business, the Senate will resume consideration of S. 1243, which is Transportation Appropriation Bill. Senator Murray will continue to work through the amendments with Susan Collins, the ranking member from Maine, and we hope to vote on confirmation of the West nomination today to be Associate Attorney General. Senators will be notified when votes are scheduled. Mr. President, about 80 years ago, when President Franklin Roosevelt first proposed Social Security as an insurance against poverty and old age, the idea was controversial, was new, never been done before, nothing like it. But in 1935, 97 Republicans joined Democrats in Congress to create one of the most successful social programs in history, if not the most successful program in the history of our country and the world. 2 decades later, about 60 years ago, President Dwight Eisenhower proposed the nation's first interstate highway system, proposing the investment would pave the way for a new era of American growth. Now, why did Dwight Eisenhower do this? As a young major in the Army, he was directed to bring a convoy of troops and equipment across the country, and he determined at that time something had to be done. The roads were non-existent, and those that existed were not in very good shape. So when he became president, after having been such a successful leader of our efforts in World War II, he asked Congress to invest $50 billion. Under present-day dollars, Mr. President, that would be about $500 billion. Now, that meant almost 50,000 miles of new highways. There are still ideas out there we should do. Eisenhower, along with Roosevelt, did some things that were new and unique, but look back at what good they did. Look at the good of Social Security. Look at the good of our interstate highway system. Now, with the highway bill back in 1956, the bipartisan vote wasn't even close. Listen to this. Passed the Senate 89-1. And it was approved in the House of Representatives by a voice vote. 40 years later, 40 years ago, I should say, about 40 years after President Roosevelt decided we should do something about taking care of people in their golden years here in America, President Harry Truman envisioned a program that would protect every senior citizen from illness and need. Well, 83 Republicans helped Lyndon Johnson and Democrats in Congress create Medicare. Democratic President Roosevelt, Republican President Eisenhower, Democratic President Truman and Johnson were the reason we have Medicare. Since the law was enacted in 1965, poverty among seniors in this country has decreased and life expectancy has increased every 10 years because of Medicare. On each of these occasions that I've talked about, and countless others throughout the course of American history, lawmakers divided by political party have united to pass important, groundbreaking legislation. On the issues that matter most, when lives are at stake, when the country is at stake, and the economy of the country is at stake, it's when American competitiveness is at stake. Lawmakers divided by political party have been drawn together by shared priorities. It's time to renew that tradition. Over the last 5 years, this nation has dug its way out of a hole created by the Great Recession. Now, I could go into reasons why the Great Recession happened, but let's drop that for now. It happened. We have an opportunity now to come together again, this time to lay foundation for a stronger, smarter, and more competitive America. As Democrats and Republicans came together in those instances I gave in the past, they did it to ensure the health and dignity of our nation's seniors. As Democrats and Republicans came together to pave the way for a mobile and competitive economy, so Democrats and Republicans today must come together, today, to build a future where hard work is all it takes to turn opportunity into prosperity. Yesterday, President Obama laid out a roadmap to restore that promise for every American. It took him an hour. The speech took an hour, but every minute of it was important. He laid a vision to encourage responsible home ownership, to educate a new generation of workers, and to create jobs rebuilding Eisenhower-era roadways and bridges. Every day, I'm impressed by President Obama's focus on restoring a vibrant economy. And every day I'm encouraged by his optimism that with a little cooperation, and the help of a few reasonable Republicans, we can achieve that goal. Mr. President, we only need a handful of Republicans to break away what's gone on this past 5 years. I look forward to hearing more details from the President of his proposals in the coming days and weeks. President Eisenhower understood that lawmakers, Republican or Democrat, should be drawn together by shared priorities. We should all play on the same team. This is what he said, and I quote, "I have one yardstick by which I test every majority problem. And that yardstick is it good for America?" That's what General Eisenhower said. And he was right. And he's right today. Throughout our nation's history, Congress has used that same measure. But over the last 5 years, something has changed. When my Republican counterpart said his #1 goal was to defeat President Obama, The words "at any cost" were implied. Since 2009, Republicans have refused to join Democrats in the important job of legislating. It's work. And they've refused to join us in leading, preferring instead to stake out ideological territory or try to score political points. Republicans have balked at new ideas, but they have also balked at old ideas they once supported solely because those ideas are now favored by President Obama. This kind of opposition for opposition's sake has resulted in gridlock and, I'm sorry to say, Mr. President, dysfunction. It has resulted in bitter partisanship, hostage-taking, and standoffs. I was on a long interview on public broadcasting yesterday. They said, what about the numbers in Congress are so low? I said, I haven't gotten a call from any of those pollsters, but if I had, I would have agreed with this number. Congress has become dysfunctional, and that is unfair to the American people. And it's made it almost impossible for Congress to advance the big ideas, to achieve the big things, to realize the big dreams it once could. But it's not too late for reasonable people from both parties on both sides of the Capitol to change that. It's not too late for lawmakers divided by political party but sharing the same priorities to unite to pass important legislation. Like President Obama, I'm an optimist. I remain hopeful despite the disagreements and difficulties over the last 5 years. I am hopeful that my Republican colleagues are using the same yardstick as I am. And I know they're asking themselves, as I am, is it good for America?
Mr. President.
Republican leader.
Like the President, I appreciate a good literary reference every now and then, placed in the proper context. A citation from some great writer or thinker can sum up a vision and inspire people. When Douglas MacArthur bade farewell to West Point, he echoed an ancient thinker's ominous warning that, quote, only the dead have seen the end of war, end quote. And the biblical references in JFK's famous inaugural represent another classic use of the well-placed quote. But I think a lot of people are still scratching their heads about President Obama's promise yesterday, his promise yesterday to bring Americans an ocean of tomorrows. Frankly, I don't even think the Carl Sandburg fans out there would get it. And I really wonder, does he? Because the President himself said his speech probably won't change any minds. Even the advisors who endlessly hyped this thing more or less conceded there wouldn't be any there. No groundbreaking proposals, no tack to the center, no promise to finally start working collaboratively with Congress. Well, they were right. So really, you have to ask, what was the point? Look, this president's a terrific campaigner. We all recognize that. He's got a way with words, too. But at some point, campaign season has to end, and the working with others season has to begin. At some point, you have to start promising an ocean of tomorrows and start actually working with the representatives of the people. Because let's be perfectly clear, Americans aren't worried about how many tomorrows there are to come. They're worried about what those tomorrows will actually bring. The bills in tomorrow's mail, the cuts in tomorrow's paycheck, the affordability of tomorrow's health costs. These are the things that can't be addressed with reheated speeches or clever quotes. They require actually working with people, including those you might not always agree with. For instance, going around telling people Obamacare is working the way it's supposed to, or that it's fabulous or wonderful, as several of our Democratic friends have done, well, that doesn't really change reality. It's just words.
It doesn't change the fact that recent surveys show only 13% of Americans now believe the law will help them, or that about half believe it will make things worse for the middle class, or that actuaries are now predicting cost increases of 30% or more in my home state of Kentucky. Now, I know the President likes to point to the few places, as he did yesterday, where premiums might actually drop under Obamacare, but he's basically silent on the places where it's been announced that premiums will go up under Obamacare. And he won't say a word about all the people who've lost their jobs or seen their pay cut. For instance, the Washington Post recently profiled a part-time college professor from Virginia who, like many in his situation, will see his hours slashed as a result of this law. As the Post put it, for this man, the President's health care law could have meant better health insurance. Instead, it produced a pay cut. And many would agree, not for the better, especially for the growing number of Americans forced into part-time work with fewer hours and smaller paychecks as a result. As one part-time waitress interviewed in another paper said, "I can't believe I voted for this. This is not the change I wanted, and it feels like there's no hope." So if the President is ready to pivot from campaign mode to governing mode, he can start by dropping the misleading claims and admitting what pretty much everybody knows, that a lot of Americans are going to feel the pain once this ocean full of tomorrows finally crashes ashore. Americans are worried, and I don't blame them. Just last week, as I often do, I met with employers from around Kentucky who expressed continued concerns about the impact the law will have on their operations. They want the Democrats who run the Senate to follow the House's lead in delaying Obamacare for everyone, both businesses and individuals. And they know it makes sense to do so. And I know they want the President to sign the bill when it passes, and I agree he should. It would be a great first step toward implementing the permanent delay our country needs, a delay that would give Republicans and Democrats the chance to start over and work together this time on a bipartisan, step-by-step set of health reforms that would actually lower costs. But we can't get there until the President changes his mindset, until he puts the poetry down for a moment, flips the campaign switch off, and the governing switch on. And when he does, I think he'll be surprised to find just how many Republicans want to do exactly what we've said all along, to work with him on solutions to get our economy moving, our jobs growing, and our health care more affordable. We're waiting. Americans are waiting. I hope he'll finally be ready soon. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved. Under the previous order, the Senate will be in a period of morning business until 11 a.m., with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each, with the time equally divided and controlled between the two leaders or their designees, with the majority controlling the first 30 minutes and the Republicans controlling the second 30 minutes. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Mr. President.
Senator from Minnesota.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would suggest that that this be vitiated.
Without objection.
Thank you. Mr. President, I rise today to discuss a problem I have spoken about many times over the past 3 years, beginning with debate on the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform Bill. That bill, which Congress passed in July of 2010, contained a provision I authored with my Republican colleague, Senator Roger Wicker of Mississippi. Our provision gave the Securities and Exchange Commission the authority to issue a rule to address the conflicts of interest inherent in the credit rating industry, conflicts of interest which contributed mightily to our recent financial collapse and that has continued to plague that industry through today. I'm speaking about this issue again because even though the conflicts continue to put our economy at risk, the SEC still has not proposed meaningful reforms. The SEC has studied the issue. The Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission has studied the issue. The Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations has studied the issue. Now it is time to move forward and take action on the issue. Let me start off by briefly reminding everyone what this conflict of interest is about and why it is important. In the years leading up to the 2008 financial collapse, the credit rating agencies were enjoying massive profits and booming business. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with massive profits and booming business, but there was one fundamental problem. Booming business was coming at the expense of accurate credit ratings, which is supposed to be the entire reason for the existence of the credit rating agencies. Credit rating agencies were and still are paid to issue ratings directly by the Wall Street banks issuing the paper and requesting the ratings. If a rating agency, let's say Moody's, does not provide a AAA rating that the bank wants, the bank can then just take its business over to Fitch or S&P's. That's called ratings shopping, and it continues to this day. The opportunity for rating shopping creates incentive for the credit raters to give out those AAA ratings even when they are not warranted, and that is exactly what happened. It's exactly what happened with the subprime mortgage-backed securities that played such a crucial role in the financial crisis, and it happened over and over again. It became ingrained in the culture of the industry. The Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, chaired by Senator Levin, took a close look at the big three rating agencies, examined millions of pages of documents, and released an extensive report detailing the internal communications at Moody's, S&P, and Fitch. Among the many troubling emails, there's one in particular from an S&P official that kind of sums up the prevailing attitude quite nicely. Quote, "Let's hope we are all wealthy and retired by the time this house of cards falters." With all the risky bets in the financial sector and bets on those bets, our financial sector indeed became a house of cards. But without the conduct of the credit raters, the house of cards would have been just one card tall. 2 years after that email was written, that house of cards didn't just falter, it collapsed. And because that house of cards had grown several stories high, when it collapsed, it brought down the entire American economy with it. The financial meltdown cost Americans $3.4 trillion in retirement savings. It triggered the worst crisis since the Great Depression with its massive business failures and mass foreclosures and job losses and the explosion of our national debt. The crisis profoundly affected the everyday lives of millions of Americans in so many negative ways, including in Minnesota. People lost their homes. They lost their jobs. They lost their retirement savings. They lost their health insurance. I previously on the floor shared the story of my constituent Dave Berg of Eden Prairie, Minnesota, but it's worth sharing again. He testified at a field hearing I had in May of 2010 and told his story about having to start over, finding a new job, rebuilding his retirement savings at 57 years of age. His reflections on his experience in the recession mirror those of millions of other Americans. He said this, quote, "The downturn of the economy caused in part by the abuses on Wall Street led to the loss of my retirement security. Reforming the way Wall Street operates is important to me personally because I have a lot of savings yet to do, and I simply cannot afford another Wall Street meltdown. I need to have confidence in the markets. I need to know that there is accountability to those who caused the financial crisis." It is hard to overestimate the extent to which the credit rating agencies contributed to the financial crisis in which millions like Dave Berg lost their jobs, their homes, and far too many Minnesotans had their hopes for the future dashed. And these Americans are not necessarily seeking retribution from Wall Street. They just need to be reassured and assured that it won't happen again. They know that there is a problem and the problem needs to be fixed. We do not need further proof of that, but we get it in the February complaint filed by the Department of Justice against S&P, in which DOJ alleges, as it stated when it filed the complaint, that the credit rating agencies, quote, or S&P in this case, quote, falsely represented that its ratings were objective, independent, and uninfluenced by S&P's relationships with investment banks, when in actuality S&P's desire for increased revenue and market share led it to favor the interests of these banks over investors, unquote. The complaint highlights the patently problematic way the credit rating agencies habitually did business. One email obtained in that investigation from a high-level S&P official reads, quote, "We are meeting with your group this week to discuss adjusting criteria for rating CDOs of real estate assets because of the ongoing threat of losing deals." CDOs, collateralized debt obligations, are one of those derivatives or bets that added stories to the house of cards. This official had apparently become so comfortable with the culture of conflicts of interest that he appeared to have no reservation about putting it in writing. In fact, a while ago, S&P asked the judge in the case to throw out the Justice Department lawsuit against them by pointing to a previous decision made by a U.S. District Court judge in an earlier securities fraud case against them. That earlier suit against S&P had been filed by shareholders who said they bought their shares believing that S&P's ratings were independent and objective, as S&P had long declared. But the judge in that earlier case dismissed the shareholder suit, finding that S&P's statements that their ratings were independent and objective were mere puffery. In other words, that no one could really take S&P's statements about their ratings, objectivity, and independence seriously. It was just puffery, advertising that no one could believe. Very recently, S&P tried to use, in their briefs, in the Department of Justice's case against them, they filed, in their filing, they used the earlier puffery ruling to try to get the Justice Department suit thrown out against them. So S&P's legal argument was that no one could reasonably think that they had a reputation for producing independent and credible ratings. Thankfully, earlier this month, the judge in the DOJ suit ruled that the DOJ suit could go forward, saying last week that he found S&P's puffery defense to be, quote, deeply and unavoidably troubling. S&P's rationale should strike us all as deeply and unavoidably troubling, because their legal defense, this is S&P's legal defense, is that no one could possibly rely on their ratings. But that was their job, to provide independent, objective, accurate ratings. Millions of Americans lost their jobs because S&P didn't do its job. S&P didn't do their one job. They have one job, to provide accurate ratings. They didn't do their one job. They have no other job. I'm glad the Department of Justice is pursuing this case. But DOJ's action is not enough. It is backward-looking and addresses past harms. My concern is that the conduct continues to this day.
Senator's time has expired.
I would ask for about 5 more minutes.
Without objection.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm glad the DOJ case is going forward. But as I said, it's not enough. It is backward-looking and addresses past harms. My concern is that the conduct continues to this day. The credit raters are still influenced by the relationships with the banks, because that is who pays them. It is a clear conflict of interest, and we need to prioritize actions that will prevent another meltdown in the future. The Dodd-Frank provision I wrote with Senator Wicker, if implemented in full, would root out the conflicts of interest from the issuer pays model. The amendment we offered and that the Senate passed directed the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, to create an independent self-regulatory organization that would select which agency, one with the adequate capacity and expertise, would provide the initial credit rating of each structured financial product. The assignments would not be based just on the agency's capacity and expertise, but also, after time, on its track record. Our approach would incentivize and reward excellence. The current pay-for-play model, with its inherent conflict of interest, would be replaced by a pay-for-performance model. This improved market would finally allow smaller rating agencies to break the Big Three's oligopoly. The oligopoly is clear. The SEC estimates that as of December 31st, 2011, approximately 91% of the credit ratings for structured finance products were issued by the three largest credit rating agencies, Fitch, Moody's, and S&P, each of which was implicated in the PSI investigation. The other 5 agencies doing structured finance make up the remaining 9%. The current oligopoly does not incentivize accuracy. However, if we move to a system based on merit, the smaller credit rating agencies would be better able to participate and could serve as a check against inflated ratings, helping to prevent another meltdown. In our proposed model, the independent board would be comprised mainly of investor types, managers of university endowments and of pension funds, who have the greatest stake in the reliability of credit ratings, as well as representatives from the credit rating agencies and the banking industry and academics who have studied this issue. Our amendment passed this body, passed the Senate with a large majority, including 11 Republican votes, because this is not a progressive idea, it's not a conservative idea, it's a common sense idea. The final version of Dodd-Frank modified the amendment to be frank, put more decision-making authority in the hands of the SEC as to how to respond to the problem of conflicts of interest in the credit rating agency industry. The final version directed the SEC to study the proposal Senator Wicker and I made along with other alternatives and then decide how to act. The SEC released its study in December. The study acknowledged the conflicts of interest in the credit rating industry and reviewed our proposal and many of the alternatives, laying out the pros and cons of each without reaching a definitive conclusion on which route to pursue. The study also proposed holding a roundtable discussion to further examine reform opportunities. This SEC convened this roundtable on May 14th, and both Senator Wicker and I had the opportunity to present opening remarks. Bloomberg News had a good article on the roundtable on May 14th rather, including several key quotes that I'm going to use in my remarks today. The roundtable provided a rigorous examination of our proposal and of alternatives. One executive at a smaller rating agency endorsed the concept of a rotating assignment system to help break up the current oligopoly. Jules Kroll, the CEO of Kroll Bond Rating Agency, said of the big three, they're selling themselves out just as they did before. I'm anticipating, Mr. President, they may have to go. I got about 3 minutes left before you have to interrupt me and tell me that my time is up. Could I have those 3 minutes?
Without objection.
Thanks. The big three were also represented at the roundtable. An S&P representative argued against meaningful reform, suggesting, quote, a government assignment system could create uncertainty, could slow down markets and disrupt capital flows at a time when we could least afford it. And he didn't mention puffery. Unsurprisingly, I disagree with his characterization and would indeed suggest that what we can least afford is to maintain the status quo. An alternative proposal, the continuation of the 17G5 proposal, was met with more than a little skepticism. The 17G5 program seeks to encourage unpaid, unsolicited ratings by requiring the sharing of data on which ratings are based. The theory is unsolicited ratings will keep paid ratings honest. Joseph Petro of Morningstar Credit Ratings said that using the unsolicited rating program, quote, is not the best use of resources as we're trying to build out our ratings platform. SEC Commissioner Troy Paredes made a strong point that he noted that negative unsolicited ratings by a firm, quote, may not be the best way to get business in an issuer-pays setting. And by the time the report was written, the 17G5 program had produced only 1 or 2 ratings. I have said all along that I believe that Senator Wicker's and my proposal is a good one and the right one, and I have continued to believe that more and more as I've thought about it and looked at it in the years now since we wrote the legislation. But I've also said that I'm open to any other meaningful proposals, and I will support any proposal the SEC recommends that addresses the conflicts of interest in a meaningful way. But the roundtable made very clear once again that reform is necessary and that the status quo is inadequate to protect American investors, workers, and homeowners in the years ahead. Dealbreaker.com, a satirical blog that covers Wall Street, ran a post on the day of the SEC roundtable with this title, quote, "The SEC will keep talking about credit rating agencies until everyone stops paying attention." That is one approach that Wall Street regulators can choose to take, and it would be completely unacceptable. To do that would be to fail the American people. Senator Wicker and I have worked with the SEC continuously over the past 3 years, and I will continue to pursue this issue until the SEC fulfills its directive to address the conflicts of interest in the credit rating industry. I am obligated to my constituents and to the American public to make sure that that satirical headline does not become reality. I look forward to working with the SEC on the next steps toward a proposed rule on credit rating reform. Mr. President, I yield the floor, and I would note the absence. I note the presence of my esteemed colleague from Hawaii, both my esteemed colleagues from Hawaii, the one presiding, and the Senator Hirono, who is about, I believe, to ask for the floor.
Mr. President.
The Senator from Hawaii.
Mr. President, I rise today to speak in support of S-1243, the Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development and Related Agencies Appropriations Act for 2014. I would like to thank Senators Murray and Collins, Senators Mikulski and Shelby for their hard work. The bill before us reflects the bipartisan agreement that funding our nation's transportation and housing infrastructure is vital to creating jobs and supporting strong communities. I'd like to thank the committee for funding programs that support projects that are especially crucial for my home state of Hawaii. First, the committee's bill provides nearly $2 billion for capital improvement grants which support transit projects across the country. Especially important for Hawaii is Honolulu's rail transit project, which, when completed, will provide much-needed relief for Oahu's commuters. Mr. President, studies have shown that during the morning peak period, the average travel time from East Kapolei to Honolulu is 89 minutes. 89 minutes for a 17-mile drive. The rail would turn that into a 40-minute ride above traffic. The project is estimated to remove roughly 40,000 cars from Oahu's congested roadways, providing relief for buses and other surface public transportation services. While the rail project is a crucial step forward for developing Hawaii's most populous island, it is the committee's support for Hawaii's indigenous people for which I especially extend my thanks. The committee's funding of both the Native Hawaiian Housing Block Grant and the 184A Loan Guarantee Program will help our nation continue fulfilling its trust obligations to Native Hawaiians. In 2010, the American Community Survey reported that 27.2% of Native Hawaiians in Hawaii live in overcrowded conditions, compared to 8.5% of Hawaii's total population. In addition, the overall cost of living in Hawaii is almost 50% higher than the United States average, and housing costs are almost 150% higher. Coupled with these costs is the fact that 18% of Native Hawaiians live in poverty. Congress created the Hawaiian Homelands Trust.
The majority time has expired.
Could I ask for unanimous consent for another 5 minutes?
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Congress created the Hawaiian Homelands Trust to provide housing and settlement opportunities for Native Hawaiians. However, as the statistics I just laid out show, this indigenous population continues to struggle with finding affordable, quality housing in their place of origin. That is why the Native Hawaiian Housing Block Grant, or NHHBG, is so important. These funds can be used for a variety of initiatives. For example, the current wait list for access to housing on homesteads lands is long and continues to grow. Funding the NHHBG helps the Department of Hawaiian Homelands continue developing lands to meet the housing needs of those on the wait list as well as future beneficiaries, allowing the department to effectively administer this trust responsibility. The 184A program is another important tool for assisting Native Hawaiians in securing homes and homesteads, lands that they cannot own. As I've mentioned, the cost of living, especially housing in Hawaii, is among the highest in the country. On top of saving up the cost of a down payment for a mortgage, there is the tricky task of securing a mortgage for a home without ownership of the land beneath it. This has proved problematic not only for Native Hawaiians, but also Native Americans and Alaska Natives. The 184A Loan Guarantee Program helps get Hawaiians onto homesteads by providing a guarantee for lenders who are unfamiliar with the Hawaiian Homes Program. I also want to thank the committee for supporting the Essential Air Service program. Being an island state, Hawaii is uniquely affected by any changes to air transportation policy. For us, driving between counties is not an option, so air service is, for all intents and purposes, the only way to get from one island to another. And there is a population in Hawaii that is uniquely the reason for the Essential Air Service program: the residents of Kalaupapa. Kalaupapa is an isolated peninsula on the island of Molokai. Beginning in 1866, this area was used as an exile for Hansen's disease patients. This practice continued until quarantine of the area was finally lifted in 1969. It is precisely because of Kalaupapa's remoteness and isolation that it was selected to serve this function for Hansen's disease patients. There are Hansen's disease patients who still reside in Kalaupapa. Their only option for getting in and out of the area for medical treatment or to visit family and friends is flying. Maintaining proper funding for the Essential Air Service program directly translates into assuring continued access for the people of Kalaupapa to other communities and the services that they need. The committee's bill also provides appropriate levels of funding for larger national programs like the Community Development Block Grant, or CDBG. Certainly, Hawaii has been able to put CDBG funds to good use, and agencies across the country rely on this essential block grant funding to continue meeting the needs of their most vulnerable populations. The HOME Investment Partnerships Program is yet another example where the funding level in the Senate's bill is warranted. If Hawaii is any indication, home funds move out the door so quickly that many sub-grantees with equally worthwhile projects are left waiting for the next fiscal cycle to compete. The support for CDBG, HOME, and other programs in the bill provides communities across the country with the means to provide safe, affordable housing for the least fortunate, the elderly, and others. However, as the wide support for these programs demonstrate, there is more need in our communities than there are resources. Since the sequester has taken effect, things have only gotten harder for those who are struggling the most. Every day, it seems we hear about housing vouchers being frozen or rescinded, or about how elderly or support services are being cut back, or about how the lines for limited public housing grow as people who've been out of work for too long exhaust their savings. For many of the people that rely on these programs, there is nowhere else to turn. This bill doesn't fix all the problems caused by sequester, nor does it fully address the critical needs to create jobs. However, it is a bipartisan step forward that makes positive progress in both of these areas. Perhaps it will give us some momentum in tackling those big challenges our nation faces in a more comprehensive way. I urge my colleagues to support this important legislation. Thank you, Mr. President, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Republican whip.
Mr. President, we now know that the IRS targeting scandal implicates senior officials at the very highest levels of the Internal Revenue Service. Indeed, we know that the IRS's chief counsel's office, headed by an administration appointee, was aware of the abuses, according to sworn testimony in the House of Representatives. We know that former IRS Commissioner Douglas Shulman categorically denied those abuses in March of 2012, even though senior IRS officials learned about them as early as June 2011. We know that the IRS official who first revealed the abuses to the American people decided to take the Fifth Amendment, invoking her right not to incriminate herself, rather than testify before Congress. And finally, we know that IRS officials improperly targeted not only conservative organizations, but also political candidates and donors. And still, yesterday, the White House press secretary called the various scandals involving this administration phony scandals. Well, I don't know anyone who actually believes that's true when an institution like the Internal Revenue Service, with its power literally to tax and destroy, is abusing that power. This is something that deserves the investigation and of Congress, and we need to get to the bottom of it. But the idea, as initially floated out, that this scandal was the work of a few rogue staffers in the Cincinnati office is no longer plausible, even if it was at one point. This scandal clearly represents a serious breach of the public trust and has created a major credibility problem for this agency that's supposed to be objective and nonpartisan. It's bad enough that America's tax collection authority has behaved like a thuggish political machine, indeed policing political speech and rights guaranteed under the First Amendment to the United States Constitution. To make matters worse, the Internal Revenue Service will soon be responsible for administering some of the most important provisions of the Affordable Care Act, otherwise known as Obamacare, including the individual mandate. In other words, the Internal Revenue Service will be responsible for administering a law that affects 1/6 of the United States economy, and it will be collecting even more information about individual American citizens. Are we really comfortable with dramatically expanding the power of an agency that's proven so abusive and so untrustworthy? I know I'm not, which is why 2 months ago I introduced a piece of legislation that would prevent the Internal Revenue Service from participating in its current role of implementing Obamacare. Yesterday I submitted this legislation as an amendment to the appropriations bill that we're currently considering. Rather than give more power to the Internal Revenue Service, we should be giving more power to patients and their doctors. Remember, even before Obamacare became law, the IRS had enough power to destroy the lives of American citizens. In the famous words, I believe, of the Supreme Court Justice, the power to tax is the power to destroy. And he had it right. Now the worst possible time to give this agency such massive influence over the U.S. health care system is past overdue action on our part. Instead, we should be curtailing the Internal Revenue Service's power, replacing Obamacare with sensible, patient-centered alternatives. And my amendment would do that. Mr. President, before I conclude, I'd like to mention another amendment that we will be filing to this appropriations bill, one that I've co-sponsored with my friend from South Carolina, Senator Graham. Our amendment would prevent any funds in this bill from being used to bail out Detroit or any American city that mismanages its public finances. We have a federal bankruptcy code, Chapter 9 specifically, that was designed to handle these problems, and Detroit has filed for bankruptcy. There's no good reason why Detroit or any other American city ought to receive a taxpayer-funded bailout from Washington. I hope that the normal bankruptcy process will be allowed to go forward, and I hope that the bankruptcy follows the rule of law and the Obama administration resists any temptation to meddle in the process and play politics. My colleagues might recall that during the 2009 government-run Chrysler bankruptcy process, the company's secured bondholders received much less for their loans than the United Auto Workers pension funds. My colleagues might also recall that during the run-up to the 2011 Solyndra bankruptcy, the Obama administration actually made taxpayers subordinate to private lenders in violation of the law. Detroit's financial woes offer a warning to all cities and states that are struggling with pension obligations and unfunded liabilities. And speaking of unfunded liabilities, the federal government currently owes more than $100 trillion worth of unfunded liabilities ourselves for Medicare and Social Security, something that urgently needs our attention. It's time for government officials at all levels, at the state, federal, and local, to make the hard fiscal choices that we've been postponing for way too long. Mr. President, I yield the floor and suggest the absence of quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.